Well, when you look at the objections that most people have with Paul, especially those on the left, um, I think really in total there are two main strands of objection to him. On the right, there are those who are military warmongers, and they view his sanity as a form of appeasement and wanting Hitler and whatever. And that rhetoric is you need to know a little bit about foreign policy and how unthreatening states like Iran is, and how unremarkable it is that the Persians would exercise influence in the Persian Gulf. Uh, but on the left, I think most of the arguments against him really, they're not about racism or homophobia or sexism really so much as they are, there's a principled opposition to his view on states' rights. And it's often asserted that Ron Paul believes in states' rights. And I certainly can see why, but I think that there's a case to be made that really he's not. Because Ron Paul has said many, many times that states don't have rights, that only individuals have rights. And I don't think that any meaningful definition or ideology that could be termed states' rights could have as its basis the idea that states have no rights and only individuals do. Now that's a whole other thing to flesh out that I don't know if it ever really has. Ron Paul, in that sense, could not possibly be a states' rights activist. But what Paul does advocate could be construed to be de facto states' rights, in the idea that he wants decentralization and devolution of power. Now he is explicit that he thinks the farther that goes, the better, and that by implication and on many occasions explicitly means to the individual. But along that line of reasoning, logically that would mean a devolution from federal power to state power. It would also logically mean a devolution from, say, the United Nations or NATO to the national level, and so forth, so on and so forth. And among the left, this is totally erroneously judged to be something that condones, enables, or encourages state evil. The argument most common is going to be applied and say, if you are for states' rights, then you are for Jim Crow. If you are for states' rights, you are for slavery. If you are for states' rights, you are for the woman's right to choose to be abolished on a state-by-state basis, or religion to be taught in school, or any number of other things. And with this, of course, or gay marriage. This is, of course, totally erroneous. And the whole doctrine behind it is not only erroneous, but very dangerous. And this is why I think I'm bringing it up here, because it's a part of liberal ideology that they need to not take for granted, and perhaps consider that there's something to be said for a less powerful, more decentralized organization, and not to have the federal government. The narrative that liberals are talking about is the narrative that you will read in any high school history book. And it's not false in the sense that the states in the United States have all done bad things. Probably all of them. You know, the states in the South had Jim Crow. The states at various times perhaps raised militias to fight the Indians or oppose the Indians. They've imposed taxes. They've been they largely done miscarriages of justice, if you look at the civil rights movement, where they wouldn't prosecute murderers or whatever. And we can just go down the line of all the bad things that individual states have done. And in this sense, the liberals are correct. But then the liberals have a huge omission, because the evils that the federal government has committed, I mean, and this is even if you give them passes on a lot of things that they shouldn't get passes on, are many, many orders of magnitude more horrific and terrible than anything the individual states have done. And even to a liberal ideology. So excluding now all the wars, you know, without opening the can of worms of whether World War II was justified or not, World War I almost certainly was not. That's the federal government. The Spanish-American War was not. The Vietnam War was not. The war in Iraq was not. The war in Afghanistan, at least as it was fought, was not. You might make an argument at some level maybe a strike against bin Laden would have been okay. That's not what happened. What's going on in Yemen and Pakistan and Uganda and Libya, those are not legitimate. That's all the federal government. It's interesting that there's such a strong association with racism at the state level because it is the federal government that enshrined slavery in the Constitution. It is the federal government that enforced slavery. So when northern states that were free, that were, I mean, let's not cookie cutter, they were probably very racist. A lot of the northern states like Illinois that didn't have slavery banned free blacks from even living there. But if slaves ran away and they were aided, the federal government would force those states via the fugitive slave law to not repatriate, but to re-enslave the slaves that had escaped. That's a federal power. All the wars against the Indians, the horrible genocidal wars against the Indians that were later in the 19th century were explicitly designed as genocidal wars against the Indians. They were instigated and carried out by the federal government. Now, over the years, the states, the various militia organizations of the states did bad things too, but on a far smaller scale and far less frequently than the federal government. And this is something, I mean, I don't know any liberals who defend what happened to the Native Americans, but when they talk about the evils of the government, of the state governments, they have this huge blind eye to that proto-Holocaust, really. Even if it might not even be proto because it's a real Holocaust. No, this is policy. This is actual policy of the federal government. And then the concentration camps that they put the Indians in, the reservations. And this is actually a federal tyranny that continues to this day. The federal government still treats Native Americans like crap. And that is a federal evil. And then, of course, there's the internment of the Japanese in World War II. That was a federal crime. All the dastardly experiments they did on African Americans, giving them syphilis and stuff, that's the federal government. We could go on and on and on. If you're a right-winger, you can point to other things, you know, like Waco, like Ruby Ridge, like the gun runner. Like, is it the states that are giving guns to cartels to try and make either drug busts or pass new gun laws? No, that's the ATF. It's a federal agency. You know, and all the federal agencies, you can pick whichever ones you want. We can find all kinds of levels of graft and corruption and evil going all the way up to including murder. And so the idea that, well, the federal government is just this righteous force of change totally ignores history. You might find in certain situations where its actions nullified bad acts of the states. There are some of the cases like that. But then to ignore all of its own evil actions and come up with an assessment that says we should have a strong central state because the individual states can be bad, fails because the federal government can be bad. And when the federal government is bad, it is much worse. You know, if at the very least the Jim Crow laws, the blacks could leave. And indeed they did. Who has not heard of the great migration of blacks to the northern cities? Which, despite all of their racism, those blacks judged to be better than where they were coming from. If, however, the federal government had been Jim Crow, as it was in the 19th century, then there is no place for them to have gone other than to completely leave the country. And this is still the case. So the fascist healthcare reform bill, which requires all Americans to pay money to a corporation, an insurance corporation, or be imprisoned, fined and then imprisoned, you know, those are the steps, is not like when Massachusetts did it. If you didn't like it, you could move to New Hampshire. Now there's no place to go other than to flee the country, and there's a tax on that. The IRS will not let you do that without paying heavy penalties. So I think that liberals should be very, very cautious and just assuming that states' rights implies any kind of evil. You know, we could get another right-wing president like George H.W. Bush, who would try and abolish abortion in the entire country. Now, I have my views on abortion. I know that my subscribers have varying views on abortion. I'm not going to make an abortion video right now. The point is, if you're liberal and you're like, well, I don't want to see abortion made legal or made outlawed anywhere, by favoring federal power, you're risking that abortion might be outlawed everywhere. That's the risk. And if you just embrace federal hegemony to the point of condemning anybody who would suggest otherwise, then you are risking that, and it is a very real risk. You know, and at this point, it should not be a conspiracy theorist or considered beyond the pale to speak of the potential abuse and evil of the federal government. Not after Obama signed the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, just a few days ago, saying that he can kill or imprison any American without trial anywhere in the country. All right, or the Patriot Act, or the FISA, you know, the wiretapping, all these things that the federal government has done. Even if you are nominally okay with them, you must recognize the potential for abuse. And in many of the cases where it's possible, the abuse has already been documented. You know, the Patriot Act has been used by the federal government many, many, many times. And only very rarely is that for somebody who could even, in the most plausible stretch of the imagination, be considered some kind of terrorist. You know, a lot of times it's used against importers or toy manufacturers or kids who protest, or, I mean, they're using people in cattle disputes. They're using predator drones. This happened in Montana. A guy got into a dispute over cattle, over free-ranging cattle, and he had a drone, fortunately at this stage, that did not vaporize him somehow, surveil him. This is clearly an abuse, and this is something that you get with federal power. You can't nullify federal power if your entire ideology is that federal power must be preeminent and predominant and overarching. And that is the counter to what Paul is offering. You know, the other thing that they'll say is, well, we want a hegemon, you know, a powerful federal government, but it's going to be nice. It's going to respect civil liberties and civil rights, and it's going to be, you know, not racist, and it's going to be, you know, a benevolent Leviathan. And there is no promise you can make to that. You can't come to me and say, I will vest you with legislative power, judicial power, a monopoly on arbitration, at least for most things, a monopoly on force, and please just promise that you'll be a nice guy. Sure, I'll promise that if that's the deal. Sure, that's a great deal for me, and then I can start doing whatever I want after that. And if we ever have a dispute over it, I can just say, well, no, I rule that I didn't break the rules. There is no basis at all for assuming that any kind of promise that the federal government makes is binding, because it makes its own rules. And plus, they don't even make that promise. They don't promise that they'll actually help you, that they'll actually not abuse you. There's no promise whatsoever in the bills that they sign, and they can violate it at any time. So I guess the 2 points here is I think it's a little ideologically ambiguous to say that Paul is a states' rightser, because he believes in individual rights. I think that all the arguments that what he's advocating is somehow enabling state tyranny. Yes, but it's at the benefit of negating the possibility of far greater tyranny at the federal level, which is a historical and demonstrable fact. You know, killing all the Indians, imprisoning the Japanese, all the railroad, all the corporatism, the wars, all of the wars. Okay, if you think one or two of the wars are okay, like World War II, fine, that's a different story. What about all the wars that are not okay? What did any state do that was as bad as the Vietnam War or the war in Iraq? You know, none of them did anything as bad as that, ever. So, and then, I mean, well, I'm not going to get into that in this video, but to not even, I mean, it'd be one thing if you said, okay, I've weighed in the balance all the bad things the federal government does, and I still come down. But I've never heard, they just don't acknowledge. They just pretend like it's always been, you know, LBJ sitting at a table with MLK behind him, giving people rights, or giving women the vote, or whatever. I mean, oh, here's one, like Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal government. You know, he got rid of whatever blacks there were in the bureaucracy. He's this great, you know, democratic, fascistic president. You know, and does anyone go, well, look, the federal government can become racist and disenfranchise blacks. Maybe they shouldn't have so much power. No, they just think, oh, it should have more power, and that way it can stop the states from doing it. So, at the very, I acknowledge fully the ability of the states to do evil things, but the extent of that evil is limited, and so not to be as feared. And there's a check against that if you can leave the state, if the other states don't change. There's less check, not no check, but there's less check against the abuses of the federal government. And that's an important thing that Paul is talking about. And that's something that you should listen to and that you should consider before you just dismiss. And of course, it's also completely erroneous to say, I think the state should have the power to this. Hence, he's in favor of a potential abuse. You know, that's like saying, I think parents should be able to educate their own children, and hence that means that I'm saying that I want parents to rape their children. No. It's possible if parents are educating their own kids that they might rape their children. You know, if I say I think people should be allowed to drive, that doesn't mean I want them to commit vehicular homicide. That's 2 or 3 huge logical leaps. It's fear-mongering, but it's a very common knee-jerk reaction. And I don't know. I think part of the reason is because liberals see in their mind as the pinnacle of society is a welfare state of some kind. They have different ideas of what that should be, and that's what they think society is going towards and should be going towards. And so any step away from that is anathema, is anti-historical, is evil. But that view of the benevolent Leviathan ignores history. What was the first modern welfare state? Was it Sweden? Was it Denmark or the Netherlands? Or no. Iceland? No. Bismarck, Germany. Bismarck era Imperial Kaiser Germany, the most militaristic, corporatist, fascistic state in the last 200 years, consistently, before the Nazis even, was Germany. And Hitler's Nazi Germany was a welfare state with health care for all and jobs for all and building programs. So the idea that, you know, an empowered federal government, national state is good is highly dubious, if not completely erroneous. Theoretically, it doesn't make sense. Vesting the power in one institution or person guarantees abuse, as far as I'm concerned. Literally guarantees it. At the very least, they don't have the knowledge to do what's right. So, but liberals see this as the inevitable and desirable flow of history. And so because of that, anybody who speaks against it, they're a maniacal, evil, racist, sexist, homophobe. And they must be stopped and ridiculed. And they make these outrageous claims like, you know, believing in the 10th Amendment means you want blacks to be lynched or gays to be stoned to death. False. So tonight, it's the Iowa caucuses. Come what may, I'm probably going to go to bed and not pay too close attention. That's irrelevant. The main thing, that's not irrelevant, but the important thing is what's going on up here. So that's it. Good night, everybody.